year 725, a Christian monk in the kingdom of Northumbria, known as the Venerable Bede, wrote a Latin manuscript called the Temporum Rationae, meaning the reckoning of time. This script served as a guide to the calendars of the known world, and for our purposes it would be inconsequential if not for the details he wrote about the Anglo-Saxon calendar. Bede, being a Christian monk, kept all things pagan at a distance, but nonetheless he would give details for the names of the months in the calendars he spoke of. As a result, he provided the only direct attestation of two pagan goddesses, even if he only mentioned them briefly. While much can be learned about the practices of the Anglo-Saxons through his mentioning of all of these months, today I should like to talk about just three which have piqued my interest. Solmonath, covering a time roughly analogous to February, Hrethmonath, analogous to March, and Eostre to April. Bede writes, Solmonath can be called month of cakes, which they offered to their gods in that month. Hrethmonath is named for their goddess Hreda, to whom they sacrificed at this time. Eostre has a name which is now translated Paschal month, and which was once called after a goddess of theirs named Eostre, in whose honor feasts were celebrated in that month. Now they designate that Paschal season by her name, calling the joys of the new rite by the time-honored name of the old observance. Solmonath is not the main focus of this video, so this is a bit of a side tangent, and this is merely me speculating, so I'll keep it brief. To me, the Anglo-Saxons offering cakes to their gods is of interest because of a possible relation to the festival of Imbolc. Imbolc is an Irish festival honoring the Celtic goddess Brigid. Now, of course, the Anglo-Saxons are a Germanic tribe and the Irish are Celtic, but the tribes would have had a level of interrelation and influence on one another over the centuries, as well as both originating from one ancient Indo-European tribe. Different festivals in Europe have analogues elsewhere, and while what is known of Imbolc does not necessarily apply to Solmonath and vice versa, it is interesting nonetheless to speculate on the role Solmonath could have taken in light of what is known of Imbolc. Of what Bede mentions here, by far the most is known about Eostre. Bede mentions that the Christian Paschal season is designated by her name. This is still true in modern English. What we call Easter, other Germanic languages refer to in some cognate of Paschal. In Dutch, it's Pasen, in Icelandic Påska, in Swedish Påsk. However, in German, it's Ostern, which is a cognate with Easter, and there is an Old German term for April, Ostaramonat, similar to Eostremanoth, indicating that Eostre existed as Ostara in Germany as well. The term that we use for what is now typically considered a Christian holiday is named after, and originates, and still holds on to the traditions of, an old pagan springtime goddess, whom from now on I shall refer to as Easter, as that is the modern English rendering of her name. Year after year I have heard people ask the same question. What do hares, eggs, sweets, and pastel colors have to do with the death of Christ? The answer is, invariably, and quite excitingly, nothing at all. The Anglo-Saxons, like all other pre-Christian Europeans, were animistic, believing that everything, all the different elements of nature, hold spirits, regarding the earth, the moon, and the sun as deities, for example. Given this, and that Easter is celebrated in the spring, we can infer that she would have been associated with spring, fertility, and the rebirth of the land. To this day, the hare is closely associated with fertility, for the way that they breed quite quickly. You're probably familiar with the idiom, breeding like rabbits. Her association with rabbits is therefore further evidence that Easter is a springtime fertility goddess. As for eggs, chickens without artificial heating will not lay eggs below a certain temperature. Since nothing grows in the winter, winter was a time of death and starvation for ancient Europeans. At a certain point in the spring, chickens would start laying eggs again, and this would be some of the first new food they would have had access to for months, making eggs and spring a symbol of salvation and providence. For that alone, this time would be worth celebrating. Pastel colors are associated with flowers, and are therefore another representation of fertility and the rebirth of this land. As for candy, well, that's just how the time was celebrated. You're likely well familiar with egg hunts for children on Easter morning. Oh, and I should probably mention that the Easter Bunny is a mythical figure we tell our children about, was invented by Lutheran Christians more recently as an analog of Santa Claus. Given Easter's etymological relationship to other Indo-European deities such as Roman Aurora and Greek Eos, as well as Easter's association with East, she is suspected to be a goddess of the East and of the dawn, like the other goddesses I just mentioned. However, this is subject to some debate. In Philip A. Shaw's Pagan Goddesses in the Early Germanic World, which provided the bulk of my knowledge about this topic, Shaw argues that there is insufficient linguistic evidence to show a relationship between Eostre and of the East. I am not so fluent in my understanding of linguistics that I can form much of an argument about the matter, so my resolve is to take this detail about her with a grain of salt. However, it certainly does appear to fit with her character, being a goddess of rebirth, and I do suspect that she does indeed relate to Aurora and Eos, given her name, aesthetic, and role. I have a theory about the goddess, however in presenting it I hope you understand that I am not a folklorist and as such will not take it too seriously, as this is merely semi-educated conjecture. Seeing as how Easter was likely associated with the dawn, I wonder if she may have been associated with magic and witchcraft as well. Witchcraft in of itself warrants several videos worth of content, and it is beyond the scope of what I am presenting to you today. But to understand the connection, you need only understand that magic was associated with the in-between. Transitions between states and times, such as the dawn and dusk, the fall and the spring, held with them magic. Given Easter's association with rebirth, the spring, and of the dawn, it would not be a surprise to me if she was thought of as a powerful sorcerer. Magic was also seen as a feminine trait in Germanic societies, hence witches being depicted as female. In that book I just mentioned, Shaw makes a case that it is possible that the goddess Easter and Hreda may have been goddesses of location rather than of role. Though I would interject, why not both? He makes a good case for Easter having been associated with a locality in Kent, since many ancient wells, hills, and rivers in that area appear to be named after the goddess. I find this notion interesting because I have heard of a theory in the folklore community, though unfortunately I forget by whom, that different Germanic tribes and nations may be named after Germanic deities. England after Ingfrey, Friesland after Freyr, which is interesting because both of those tribes are Ingvaeonic, Ing being the first syllable of the word there, and Ing and Freyr being two names of the same god, meaning both of these tribes were named after the same god, as well as Holland after Holla, and Austria after Ostara/Easter. This is merely a theory, and we may never have direct proof of this, but given that the Germanic tribes were animistic and believed that everything held a spirit, lands, tribes, and ethnic groups would have had them as well. And it is even known that the Anglo-Saxon god Saxnot derived the Sax part of his name from the Saxons. The implication of all this, given that Easter may have been a patron goddess of merely a small locality, would be that tribal gods may have been commonplace. I cannot help but wonder if figures such as fairy godmothers, guardian angels, house elves, and fairies, which I'll have to talk about one day, might be a reflection of familial deities, where perhaps groups of people as small as a family might have their own gods at one point, however many thousands of years ago. And again, this is merely my own speculation, but the existence of gods of location does make me wonder if these figures once held a grander role. Despite the Christian campaign to remove this goddess, we stuck onto her name and are still familiar with her symbolism. Perhaps the reason why the Christians had to take an "if you can't beat them, join them" approach with this holiday is because Easter was of vital importance to the English, and perhaps, in a way, she still is. Now before we get ahead of ourselves, you'll recall that at the beginning of this video I mentioned two goddesses, not just one. But unfortunately, and although it will lend itself well to the length of this video, much less is known about Hreda. However, it would be an injustice indeed to neglect her, as is so often done given the popularity of Easter in modern pagan and folklore communities. Historically, most of what is theorized about the goddess has come about by trying to piece together what her name meant, and inferring from that what role she could have taken based on other European deities. Shaw demonstrates, however, that each of these etymologies are shaky, so much like with Eostre, anything that is known can be debated. Historically, she has most often been thought of as connected to the Old English word hredd, meaning victory, and hredden, which is the verbal form of that word, meaning to rejoice. This is largely a result of the Brothers Grimm's comparison of her name to Old Norse hroðr, meaning fame. In the Norse sagas, specifically the Poetic Edda, a giant by the name of Hroðr is a friend of the gods. If this etymological connection is true, it is therefore likely that Hreth is the English analog for this figure, though bear in mind that what is known of one pantheon does not necessarily apply to the other, as the Germanic people never saw themselves as a unified people, and belief did vary from region to region. Another contender for Hreth's etymology is Hrad, Hrad, or Hredh, which all mean quick. Standardized spelling is a relatively new invention, and just as pronunciation varies from region to region from modern English, so it did in Old English, and thus this one word takes three forms. Likewise, Hrethmonath is variably spelt, with that initial Hreth syllable taking on much the same forms, Hrad, Hrad, and Hredh. This would provide a strong case for a relationship with Hreda and swiftness. This has led her to be interpreted as a deity something like the Greek Hermes, a speedy messenger of the gods. To my knowledge, not much more is known of the goddess. However, I shouldn't neglect to mention that a certain group of Goths were sometimes called Hrethgoten, being named after a similar sounding deity. As discussed previously with Eostre, this would imply a relationship between specific deities and specific Germanic tribes. When we take a look at Temporum Rationae, very little is known for certain about these goddesses, so much so that many have dismissed these figures as merely inventions of Bede. But ask yourself, why would a medieval Christian who feared and hated all things pagan go out of his way to talk about two goddesses unless they were of vital cultural significance? Perhaps the reason for Eostre in particular being swept under the rug is that there are those who don't like to admit that their Christian holiday has its origins in pagan belief. While most is what is known about these goddesses is uncertain, we can see that if we attempt to uncover what is hidden in plain sight, as most folklore is, a much broader picture can be painted.